Do we think the EXUMAS are better than the Bahamas Islands? 30 categories that we're going to compare. Is it worth it?
Good morning, Sailing Blown Away channel viewers.
That's a mouthful for a morning.
It is. We've spent 2 seasons in the Bahamas and we've seen all that the Bahamas offers. And it's an incredible universe, but I would say that the best part is the EXUMAS, the tenderloin of the entire Bahamas cruising experience.
But then we've spent the last 3 months in the Bahamas Islands, and we had a lot of questions about which one do you like better. So we thought we would take this opportunity to share with you our opinion on, do we think the EXUMAS are better than the Bahamas Islands? Is it worth the effort to get down to the Bahamas, because it is farther?
If you appreciate material like this, please hit that subscribe button. We would really appreciate that. Show us a little love there. Make sure you hit the like button, share. Also, please consider joining our Patreon group. All that information is down in the description, link to how you can do that.
And we love our patrons. Thank you so much for your support and encouragement. We really appreciate you.
Enough talking, let's get started.
So we have an exhaustive list. I think it's 30 categories that we're going to compare between the EXUMAS and the Bahamas Islands. And then at the end, we'll give you our opinion as to which place we enjoyed more. Just so you know, we love both of them. And
Yes.
if you don't have to make a choice, go to both. When we talk about the sailing season for both of these areas, we're focusing primarily on the months between January and June. Outside of that is a different situation for both areas. So let's talk about the weather.
Whether or not we go there.
So in the EXUMAS, one of the things that we experienced was these northerlies, and they came probably on average once a week, and they stayed 2 to 3 days. And before the northerly arrived, you had these clocking winds. So the winds would literally go from the east to the southeast to the south, southwest, west, and then it would go north. And then you were hit with winds that could go upwards of 30 knots, I would say, somewhere in there. So you always had to think about where you were going and what protection you had from the northerlies. After checking out what boats are there, we decided to head up to lee stocking to get better coverage from the wind and the big blow that's coming.
I guess just an overall comment is that when it comes to clocking winds, there are very few ideal places to hide and take cover. And if you're going to get a prime spot, you got to kind of get there early.
So comparatively, the Bahamas Islands, they have these consistent trade winds from the east. They might be blowing at 25 knots, but they are always from the east. All right, we are getting ready to pick up anchor here. It's a windy day, so hopefully this will all go well. You never have to think about, do I have to find a different place to find protection? So that consistency is something that we appreciated, and that's why we would opt for the weather of the Bahamas over the weather of the EXUMAS.
All right, let's talk about extreme weather. Outside of January to June, hurricane season, and that's always on every cruiser's mind. One of the main reasons is because of insurance. So the EXUMAS is in the hurricane belt. So to stay there, you either have to be uninsured or pay a lot of money to be insured. Down in Panama, you don't have hurricanes, but you do have lightning. In the EXUMAS, you're going to have lightning too. Yes. So you can't escape from it down there. But down in Panama, at least you can get away from the hurricanes. And I would pick, if I had to, no hurricanes.
Okay, moving on to the sailing area. We were really surprised when we did the research that the sailing area is almost exactly the same. The sailing size in square miles for the EXUMAS was 96 square miles. Granted, it's super long and very narrow. It's a strip. In Panama, the Bahamas Islands is more like a rectangle, but it is 100 square miles. So the size of the area where you are sailing is relatively the same.
So a very relevant topic is the proximity to the U.S., to southern Florida. The EXUMAS is very close to the U.S. It's going to require more planning to get to the San Blas.
And as Americans, we would emphasize the proximity to the United States to be able to go back, to provision, to get parts. So in this category, we would choose the EXUMAS over the San Blas Islands because of just the ease of having the United States so close. If you're not an American, it might not be that way because you can't get access to the United States without a visa. But for us as Americans, going back and having the great provisioning like Costco or Amazon is something that we never take for granted.
All right, so let's talk about number of islands. Both have about 365. So there's an island for every day, but there is a big difference in the number of inhabited islands. The EXUMAS has very few inhabited islands. In the San Blas, more of them are inhabited. I think this one's kind of a tie.
I'm going to combine the size of the islands and the beauty and its topography into one category. The islands in the EXUMAS typically are much larger and they're scraggly. It almost looks like moon rock.
Unrefined.
Not lush. And in the San Blas Islands, the islands are a lot smaller, like postage stamps, beautiful with white sandy beaches.
And they're like adorable little islands.
So our preference in both of these categories is the San Blas Islands.
Okay, this one kind of works in a little bit with proximity, but the remoteness of the EXUMAS is about 35 nautical miles from the top tip to Nassau, which is typically a place that you would fly into, that or Georgetown. And then it's about 150 nautical miles from the US, as opposed to the San Blas, which is about 10 nautical miles off the mainland. And then you're within a day's travel to Panama City, to an international airport.
So our preference is?
Panama City.
Talking about anchoring in the EXUMAS was interesting. It was mainly shallow. You could always find sand. And for the most part, the currents weren't too significant. Some of the anchorages, there were a lot of currents, like in Pipe Key, but most of the anchorages had very little current. And anchoring was relatively straightforward. In the San Blas, it's a little bit more complicated. There are a lot more reefs, deep anchorages, as well as a lot more current flowing through them. So finding a shallow, sandy place to anchor, we only found that in one place. Other than that, everything was really pretty deep and
tricky.
We definitely prefer
the EXUMAS. All right, navigation is a big one. One of the best places to learn how to navigate is the Bahamas. You learn how to spot things visually, and in the EXUMAS in particular, it's a very well-traveled area. So navionics is much more accurate there. So what we use in the Bahamas is navionics, and we also use Explore charts. They provide all that extra detail, GPS locations, and it's just great to have a hard copy like that. In Panama, they have a great cruiser's guide also. It's really different. Navionics is not as accurate. I would say it's more accurate than most people led us to believe, but you cannot rely on it solely. So you have to get the Bauhaus charts.
Someone has adapted them to be e-charts, and those e-charts can be put into OpenCPN. So we used Navionics OpenCPN based on the Bauhaus GPS points, but then we also did visual because visual is the most accurate. I'm doing some navigation work, putting in the points into our chart plotter. This book is the Bible of the San Blas, or Panama in general, because you can't trust the maps, unfortunately, on Navionics because they're poorly charted. So everyone has this book, and also OpenCPN. We're using the charts there because the San Blas Islands are full of reef.
And you have to plan your passages in your navigation a lot more carefully.
There are some complicating factors in the Bahamas, though, that we had to always consider, which was the tides and the currents and the cuts. Looks okay, other than the current. In the San Blas, we don't have that. It's sort of a toss-up, but in the San Blas, we thought it was going to be a lot harder than it ended up being. If you would have asked me this question before we got to the sandblast, I would have said definitely the EXUMAS. But after being in the sandblast for 3 months, I think now the sandblast.
Yeah, and the sandblast has overall protections, this outer reef that doesn't have any cuts, that protects this wider area on the inside and makes it an ideal cruising area.
All right, let's move on to watercolor. Wow, there is nothing that beats the watercolor of the EXUMAS.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen water that clear.
In the sandblast, it's not like that. There are a lot of deeper areas between each of the islands.
Yeah, they're like channels that you go through.
It does have some beautiful watercolor as well close to the islands, but it's nothing like the EXUMAS. So easy one on this to say we loved the EXUMAS. So yeah, combining clarity with color, definitely the EXUMAS wins.
Oh, the EXUMAS
blows away the sandblast.
Hands down.
The sandblast is very sediment heavy. It tends to be a lot more cloudy. You do get some days where it is clear.
You have to be more intentional about finding that, and that is normally in the outside of the barrier reef or in deeper channel areas.
Along with water color and clarity is the temperature. And in the EXUMAS, the water's pretty cold, as is the air temperature.
And you get those big northerlies coming through, or that drier, colder weather is going to be coming through, and combine it with some cold water. And you're looking for your jacket.
I would say the water temperature averaged between 77 and 80 degrees. We needed wetsuits.
And I am more warm-bodied natured, so I thought it was more refreshing, but it really borderlined on cold for me. And even the wetsuit really wouldn't do it if you wanted to stay in the water for extended periods of time.
Comparatively, in the Sandblast Islands, I would say the average water temperature was 79 to 84, 85. I would use a wetsuit most times, but towards the end of the season, I didn't even use a wetsuit, and I was fine for an hour in the water. My preference is definitely the Sandblast.
I'd say mine is too, for sure.
But one of the things I do want to just mention about the water and its turbulence is in the EXUMAS, you don't have the protection between the islands of an outer reef. Unless you were sailing on the inside of the EXUMAS, if you sailed on the outside, the waves and the turbulence was pretty significant. You always had to consider that. Going between islands in the Sandblast, you never have that because of the protection of the reef. So I would say we liked that protection. And also the distances between the islands are pretty small. It is in the EXUMAS too, but hopping between islands in the Sandblast, no matter where you're going, is not going to be a huge amount of time.
And that segues into wind direction and wind speed. If you've been to the EXUMAS, you know that this is a big deal because a lot of people stay in Georgetown Harbor. Once you leave and go north and explore the more remote islands, it's harder to get back. You've got to do a lot of motoring and beating into the wind, or you have to wait for one of those northerlies to come through. And if you have company and you're trying to plan on them getting to Georgetown, to the airport, anytime, especially with what we just talked about, you're in the Exuma Sound, which is really rough out there, coming back to Georgetown, and you're not as flexible going north to south because of the way the islands are shaped. Now you come down here to the Sandblast, the wind is northeast, so pretty much going either way you have a beam reach, so you're much more flexible, and it'll provide good sailing weather, but you won't have the swell, which is the real kicker. We'd have to vote for the Sandblast big time in this case.
Definitely. Let's talk a little bit about provisioning, because that's huge for cruisers. And in the EXUMAS, the provisioning occurred in Georgetown, Danielle Key, and then Highbourne if you were really desperate. But as you move north, the prices of everything tripled and quadrupled.
A lot of people going to the EXUMAS are bopping back and forth from the U.S. depending on the seasons. The last time we provisioned was in Chesapeake, and we just loaded up at Costco in Richmond. So our boat was about to sink on the way to the Abacos. And won't have to really buy anything except for some freshies in the Bahamas, which will cost you. And then at the end of the season, you go back to the U.S. The San Blas is a little bit different.
In the San Blas, if you start in Bocas del Toro, you can really load up there, and then it's the freshies again. Or a lot of people stop in Shelter Bay because they're easting from Bocas del Toro, and it's very difficult to do that in January. So they'll stop at Shelter and do a huge provisioning run there. So there are places where you can get groceries and provision so that you're self-sufficient in the San Blas as well. The amazing thing about the San Blas Islands is the fresh produce boat. There are 2 boats that come around to most of the anchorages twice a week, and they bring fresh produce. They'll bring anything. As a matter of fact, you can even order a special order online from one of the big grocery stores in Panama City. They will pick all of that up and deliver it to you for a price. Now, it's not cheap, but we paid, I think, $12 for a head of cabbage in Staniel Key. And we're not paying $12 for a head of lettuce down here that's being delivered to us on our boat. The beautiful thing is you don't have to take a full day trip to Panama City to provision, which actually would probably be a 2-day trip. You'd have to take a full day there, do your provisioning, and then to get back in time would be impossible. So you'd have to do an overnight.
Yeah, and the Kunas just add about 30% onto the price of the food from the grocery store. I mean, they've got to make money, but that's well worth it. We would definitely have to give the nod to San Blas in this case.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, given that these are both island groups, that there is so much of a difference in the variety of things to do in the 2 different places. For example, in the Exumas, there is so much to do on these different islands, from hiking and snorkeling to visiting caves, to underground caves, underwater caves,
grottos,
and spearfishing, and visiting the pigs, wandering through abandoned facilities, at least stocking. In the San Blas Islands, it's really about walking on the islands, enjoying that, volleyball if there's a group of people around to play, snorkeling, but that's kind of it. You can spearfish as well and do those similar water activities. And it just seems like there's a lot more in the Exumas. So given the variety of things that you can do in the Exumas, I think I would choose the Exumas over the San Blas Island.
Another vote for the Exumas.
Let's talk a little bit about snorkeling, because that is one of the activities, the main activities that we did in the Exumas as well, when it was warm enough, as well as in the San Blas Islands. And I think the common question on some of the Exuma Facebook pages was, where can we find good snorkeling? It was very hard to come by. There was not a whole lot of reef. You had to really go into the cuts, and fish life was not a lot of it. I think the exception would be Wardrick, where we lucked out with all those eagle rays.
That was epic.
But epic because it was so uncommon.
But you have to give the Exumas a little bit of credit, because even if you don't find anything, you are like bathed in that gin clear water, and the viz is incredible, and all the different shades of blue. And then if you look closer, you can find little things like octopus. That would give an advantage to the Exumas, just the clarity of the water. In
the San Blas Islands, though, there's a lot of beautiful reef. The reef is varied in its structures
and healthy.
Really incredible. There are some big schools of fish, and if you look closely and if you have some good clarity, there's some interesting things to find. It's a toss-up for snorkeling.
I think we'd have to give it to the San Blas.
We hope that you have enjoyed our comparison of the Exumas and San Blas Islands. To keep this video a manageable size, we have split it into 2 parts. So join us next week for the review of 18 more categories. Thanks for watching.